Ah, there was no delay this time. I figured out how to make this stuff work. You'd think after, 10 lectures that I'd be really efficient at this, but you know what? That's the shaping process. I get better each time, kind of, hey, sometimes I fucker it up a little bit. Oh well. All right, let's get going. Respondent conditioning, respondent procedures, or respondent applications. So let's take a look at this stuff. The reflex, right? So let's not forget that with classical conditioning, also known as respondent conditioning, what we're really talking about here is the modification of reflexes. So this is not voluntary behavior, okay? Up until this point in the quarter, we've been talking about voluntary behavior. We've been talking about operant conditioning. Now, for a little bit here, we're going to talk about respondent conditioning. The next lecture you're going to get is going to be about the combination of those things and how those things interact. But right now, we're going to look at how you can use respondent conditioning to modify certain behaviors. And there's definitely ways you can do this. In fact, I've got 7 slides on how to do it. So, all right, pay attention. Unconditional stimuli. Oops, did you hear that? Did you notice the difference there? I said unconditional. I will probably continue to say unconditional and conditional throughout this lecture because that's the original translation of it from its original Russian. Or whatever the language is that it was originally come up, invented in. What? I don't even know what I'm saying. Anyway, no, I'm kidding. The idea is that unconditional and conditional and unconditioned and conditioned, they're the same thing. Right? They mean the same thing. But again, like I was actually saying, that the original translation, the most correct translation is unconditional. But today we use the term unconditioned. So use them interchangeably. Don't worry about the fact that I'm making a fool of myself. All right. We have an unconditional stimulus, which leads to an unconditional response. Eating a nice curry. Oh, doesn't that look good? All right. What is that going to do? Just looking at a nice curry or smelling a nice curry. What do you think that's going to do? Any ideas? All right, well, here you go. Oh, sure, it's not going to work. There it is. You shall drool, right? So there's the reflex. Okay, so an unconditional stimulus is going to lead to that drooling reflex, okay, the unconditional response. Unconditioned and unconditional means you did not have to learn. You didn't have to learn anything about this. This is just automatic. It's a reflex. Okay, let's look at some others. Okay. There's that McDonald's again, and as you might realize, it's going to make you do that. No, I'm kidding. But it's an example, right? Let's say that you ate a bad meal or ate a rotten meal at McDonald's. Let's not pick on McDonald's food in general. Let's pick on something that may have happened. So you ate something that was old, or it was moldy or something like that, and then you puked as a result. Okay, and given the fact that while I'm recording this lecture, it's currently spring, you see a nice pretty flower, and there you go. All right, you've got your allergies, so you don't have to learn that stuff. This is all automatic. Okay? Are just reflexes. So what we're going to do is we're going to modify this whole thing. So let's take a look at the next slide here. All right. So we're going to take a conditioned stimulus now. Those of you that don't know, the atmosphere have clearly not traveled to Kabul, Afghanistan. All right. No, La Atmosphere is a restaurant in Kabul. This is a very popular hangout for expats, right? So the international folks, and it's decent food. It's pretty good. You can actually get bacon there. So it's a good place, and they actually have a nice atmosphere. So there's a lot of good things about La Atmosphere, but the food is one of them. So we're going to take this conditioned stimulus of the restaurant, okay, and we're going to pair that with an unconditioned stimulus of nice curry. Okay? The result is going to be that in the future, when I drive by La Atmosphere, or when you drive by La Atmosphere, that you are going to salivate. Okay, so that conditioned stimulus now leads to the conditioned response. Notice that if you go back to that previous slide, the Homer salivating was actually the unconditioned response. It is an unconditioned response if it happens to the U.S. If it happens to the CS, it's actually a conditioned response. Right? So again, the CS produces a CR, a US produces a UR. Pairing the US and the CS, which is what you're seeing here, will cause that CS to eventually produce that conditioned response. Okay. So in other words, now we don't need the US. All we have to do is show me the atmosphere, and I'll start drooling. And in fact, as I'm sitting here talking about this, I'm getting quite hungry, which is kind of odd because I just had a little, small little sandwich. And my guess is that it's because seeing this picture of our atmosphere, it's making me want food, right? So it's a conditioned stimulus. It's working as I'm doing this lecture, and I can tell you right now that I'm gonna have to go get something to eat after this because that's really actually making me hungry. Anyway, let's look at the next one. Okay, a conditioned stimulus, a florist, right? The sign, just the sign. The florist is going to be paired with the unconditional stimulus of the flowers. So if I go see the sign and I walk in and go see the flowers, and then I get my nice little reaction to that, I get my conditioned response. If I do that enough, eventually, when I see a florist sign, I might sneeze. All right, kind of cool, right? In a sense, kind of not, but that definitely is the case. So if you repeatedly pair those things, you can end up producing a reflex to something that should not produce a reflex. There's no reason a neon sign should make you sneeze, unless that neon sign has been paired with an unconditioned stimulus many times. And that unconditioned stimulus, if it leads to you sneezing, then that's how it'll work, and that's absolutely natural. Right? And this happens a lot more often than what we might think. In fact, you can start thinking about this stuff in terms of like the golden arches. Right? So if we go back to the McDonald's example, let's look at it from a more positive perspective so I don't get sued by McDonald's because I'm putting this out on the internet. Anyway, the golden arches are paired with, visually paired with really nice pictures of hamburgers, and we're just going to believe that that's really the quality of hamburger that they produce, right? So on the adverts and on the on the billboards and the TV and all that stuff, so you're going to have the golden arches, and it's going to be paired with that food. That food is a visual stimulus. Just a picture of a nice hamburger is enough to elicit a salivation and maybe even a hunger response. And so the arches paired with that picture, okay, will eventually produce that hunger. And then why do you think the McDonald's arches are so huge? I mean, it's one of the things about them that makes McDonald's work is that it's those arches where you can see them from across town, okay, which is then going to make you hungry. Or it's then going to make you start to salivate. And of course, what's your first thought? I see the arches, I start salivating, or I go, I'm kind of hungry, right? And then might as well go to McDonald's and get me some McNuggets, right, or something like that. But that's all classical conditioning. All right, let's look at some of the factors that are associated with classical conditioning. Sorry, they all came up at once. Let's just focus on the first one. So, contingency, right? The contingency between the CS and the US. This is really what is important. So, what we're talking about here is predictability. And again, you'll recall from the 324 lecture that there were some experiments that explain this and show how this actually happens. But the idea is that the more that conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus, the more powerful the conditioning is going to be. If the prediction wanes a little bit, if it gets smaller, then the CS is not going to be as likely to produce a CR. But as long as that prediction is really high, then the CS is definitely going to produce a CR. Trace conditioning is a procedure that works really well. So what we want to do here is present the CS and then turn it and then take it away for just a moment, and then the US comes on. So CS on, CS off, US on, US off. Notice that little gap in between those, right? So it doesn't have to be very long, a second or two. And that's just generally the most effective procedure. There's all sorts of other types of classical conditioning procedures. There's backward conditioning, which doesn't work hardly at all. But there's delay conditioning, and there's short delay, long delay, and all this stuff. We don't need to worry about that right now because it's for a different course. But the idea is that trace conditioning procedure works the best. Present the CS, take it away, and then just a moment later, right, then present that US. Think about the flower shop, right? You see the sign. Okay, you're walking into the building, you see the sign, you see the sign, you see the sign, then you don't see the sign because you're walking through the building, you get inside, and then you get the flowers and you start to sneeze. Right? So there's the CS, okay, which is the sign, and then it goes away because you can't see it anymore once you walk into the building, and then the US is the actual flowers, you see those, right? And you smell them, and then you start to sneeze. Okay? So that's a good trace conditioning procedure. And if we go through the atmosphere example, I see the sign atmosphere. That's actually the sign, by the way. That really is the wall, and behind that wall is the restaurant. So when you see that sign, then you're going to go through your security check, and then you're going to go inside the compound, and you eventually order your dinner. So there's a bit of a delay there. A trace there. There's quite a gap between the time you see that sign and the time you get your food. So it does work, and that, like I said, it did make me hungry just looking at it a moment ago. Okay? No experience with the CS is something else that's important. The more experience you have with a conditioned stimulus, okay, before you ever start to connect it to the unconditioned stimulus, then what we're really going to say here is that it's going to have less predictability. So if I've been exposed to, let's say, keys, I'm going to make a sound of keys here, so don't freak out. Okay, so I'm playing with my keys, right? We've all heard that sound a million times, right? So the idea is that if I then take this sound and try to pair it with food, it's going to take a lot longer, okay, to develop conditioning to that sound than what it would if I made, let's see, some other sound. Let's come up with some other sound that I could do that we might not be familiar with. Here's a good one. If anybody can even figure out what that is, I'll be surprised. Right? But the idea is that conditioned stimulus, which this sound could be, I'll do it again. Because you don't have much experience with that, I could pair that with food, and quite readily you would develop conditioning to that. And by the way, that's a plastic fork being smacked on my desk. Now I could do it with the tongue. I'm not going to mess around with it. I get distracted and start playing. All right. So the less experience you have with the conditioned stimulus before you start the training, before you start that respondent procedure, the more likely it is that you're going to develop conditioning. And again, this is all just because of that contingency, right? Because of the predictability. If you have had that experience before, then it already does not predict the unconditional stimulus. Right? Higher order conditioning, this is kind of fun. So we can take a CS, right? And then, I think I've got an example of this. All right, so here we go. So we're going to take the thing came up in the wrong order. We got CS1, so we've got the florist, right? And you got this nice car associated with that. So the CS1, we've already developed that, right? So remember that was paired with the flower. So we're now going to pair the car with the florist sign, all right? And eventually, okay, the car will produce the sneezing. I know it's a cheesy example, but the idea is that that's that higher order. So we had the flower originally. Flower produced, made flower being paired with the florist sign, then yielded sneezing. And now what we're going to do is pair something else with that florist sign, and that will also yield that new stimulus. That other neutral stimulus will also yield sneezing. We still get extinction. We still get spontaneous recovery. With this, however, we don't get that extinction burst, right? But it's still the same thing. How do you do extinction with this stuff? Think about it for just a moment before I fill in the gap. But the idea is pretty straightforward. We're going to present the CS. And then we're not going to follow it with the US. In other words, we're going to present the CS over and over and over and over and over and over and over. As we continue to present that CS, we're ruining the predictability between the CS and the US. In other words, we're extinguishing that connection between the CS and US. Spontaneous recovery happens here as well. Right? Same type of thing, where every once in a while, after a given break, sometimes that response will come back. Right? So I could continually sit here and present to you the florist sign. Right? And as I present that florist sign to you over and over and over again, eventually you won't sneeze in the presence of it. But then maybe a week later, you go driving down the road and you see another florist sign and smack, you start sneezing, right? That's spontaneous recovery. And again, if you continue down the extinction process, with each spontaneous recovery, the extinction procedure gets quicker and quicker and quicker. Okay, but it's something to expect. It's going to happen. And there's a lot more to it than this. And again, we've covered that in other classes, but that's the basics. Counterconditioning. This is kind of fun. Right? A conditioned response can be eliminated more effectively, right, if a new CR is being developed in the place of one being extinguished to a CS. Blah, 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 blah. Right? So a conditioned response, right, can be eliminated more effectively if a new conditioned response is being developed in the place of one being extinguished to a CS. Wow. In other words, we've got a spider, all right? So a CS, that elicits fear. Now, I could continually just expose you to that spider, and it's going to make you afraid. Okay? But that's going to take some work, right? Or shoot, I buggered it up. Let me try it again. So I could continually expose you to that spider. And eventually it's not going to make you afraid. We're going to extinguish that response. As long as you don't get bit by the picture or whatever here, you're going to be all right. It's not going to, it shouldn't hurt you. Okay. But over time, it's going to take some work, but eventually we'll extinguish that fear. Okay? Fear is the conditioned response here, by the way, and fear is a real conditioned response. It's very common. But we can use counter conditioning. So think of it this way. Okay? We're going to use a different CS. Right? And this one is going to be the picture of the candy. Okay? And that candy will elicit a totally different response, happiness and all these other things. Right? So now what we can do is actually pair these two. Okay? So we're going to pair the spider and the candy, and hopefully the candy will take over. Right? Maybe. There's a trick to this. We're going to have to be slow, and we're going to have to fade in the old CS. In other words, we're going to make that candy really salient to you. I'm going to bring it up close, make it big, give you lots of it. Right? And it's going to get you happy. And then a few feet away from you, I'm going to make a picture of a spider. Okay? And then the next step would be, again, I'm going to use that CS, I'm going to use the candy, and then I might show a real spider, but I'm not going to put it anywhere near you. I'm going to put it on the other side of the room, that type of thing. And then I'll slowly bring that spider closer and closer and closer and closer. Right? The idea is that you're extinguishing the response to that CS, the spider, and you're building in a new one. You're connecting that old CS, the spider, with the new CS, the candy, when the candy produces a totally different condition response. So it should be that eventually when you see a spider, you'll be okay with it. You might not be perfectly happy, but theoretically you could if you continue down these pairings. It would just take a lot of work. I'm sure you guys can think of how this could backfire really quickly, right? You could very easily become afraid of candy if you bugger up on this procedure. So don't mess around too much with counter conditioning. This is one where you better be really cautious if you're going to use it, because it can backfire. And think of a fear situation. If you're trying to get rid of a fear, and now you're connecting that fear with all sorts of other things, right? Now let's go back to a couple lectures, the last lecture, and we're talking about conditioned aversive stimuli. Guess what? That's how they develop. That's one way in which they develop, pairing these environments together. Okay? So you could accidentally screw up and create all sorts of new aversive stimuli. So I'm not a big fan of using counter conditioning. It's not my go-to thing. Right? It could be. It's useful in a lot of settings, but you have to be really cautious with how you do it. And my little parentheses there doesn't seem to emphasize how cautious you need to be. So you do this slowly. You don't just say, oh, okay, let's just pair candy and the spider and the candy will win. No, it's entirely likely the spider will win. So we're going to fade in that old CS. We're going to fade in that spider. We're going to take it real slow, and we're going to bring it closer and closer and closer and bigger, and maybe you can start with a little tiny spider or something like that. Who knows? But you get the idea. All right. The differences between these two, really straightforward. Respondent conditioning, also known as classical conditioning, elicits a response. In other words, it's a reflex. You don't have a choice. With respondent conditioning, the response is coming. It's happening. No choice there at all. Right? Again, it's a reflex. With operant conditioning, you are emitting a response. Okay? So it's coming from the organism first, then the environment is acting on it. Okay? Again, you might even say that there's a choice there. Right? Another way to classify this is respondent conditioning. Okay, yields eliciting is about eliciting behavior. In other words, it's about involuntary behavior. Operant conditioning is about when the organism emits a behavior. In other words, it's about voluntary behavior. Right? They both have extinction. You can extinguish the response. The curves look similar, other than the extinction burst. Operant conditioning produces an extinction burst, whereas classical conditioning does not. Conditioned stimuli and discriminative stimuli, they're very similar in a sense, right? So the conditioned but in this case, the conditioned stimulus elicits, it pulls a response out of you. Okay? Whereas a discriminative stimulus just says that a particular response is going to be reinforced. A discriminative stimulus is more like a, hey, you might want to do this right now because you're going to get something out of it. Whereas a conditioned stimulus says, you're going to do this right now. That sort of thing, right? So the conditioned stimulus produces a response. It's automatic. It's coming, okay, once it's been developed. And then the SD is more like, it's a gentle nudge, right? It's a little stronger than that, but I'm trying to make the distinction obvious. And sorry about freaking everybody out and banging on the table. Lots of applications here, right? Aversion therapy. What's that classical aversion therapy thing that they do with cigarettes, right? It's been in every TV show and all sorts of, books and magazines and all that stuff. And what do? They make you smoke a bunch of cigarettes all at once and get you sicker than a dog, right? That's aversion therapy. That's classical conditioning. The idea is that the cigarette, if it makes you sick, then the cigarette, you're going to want to avoid the cigarettes in the future, right? It's called conditioned suppression, and it works really well for a while. In other words, it's not necessarily permanent, but it does have some. It is useful, at least at first. Think about alcohol. Right? There's an entire treatment field around aversion therapy and alcohol. In fact, there's even research onto drugs that allow this to happen, and it's called antabuse. Right? You take the antabuse, right? And then if you have any alcohol while you've got antabuse in your system, you're going to get sick. It's just a given because of what antabuse does and how it blocks the breakdown of the alcohol in your body and blah blah blah, all this stuff. So the idea is that we're making alcohol a bad thing. Right? There's all sorts of scenarios about how aversion therapy and using antabuse to treat alcoholism is problematic. But one of those things is it's very stimulus specific. So if I'm a beer drinker, right, I may be able to use some aversion therapy and get me to stop drinking beer, but that's not going to stop me from going over and getting me a bottle of vodka, right? So in fact, I probably wouldn't get sick in the presence of the vodka. Chemotherapy is a classic situation here. Right? I've already kind of hinted at this in the past, but the idea is that, again, it's a type of aversion, right? So chemotherapy is a poison. It's going to make you sick. So it's a US. So anything you pair with that in the future is probably going to make you sick. So in other words, avoid your favorite foods when you're getting chemotherapy, because those favorite foods will be paired with sickness. Well, guess what? In the future, those might not be your favorite foods. So that's one of the things that happens with chemo. So, in fact, most doctors will give you that warning. They'll say, before you come in for chemo, don't eat that. It's like, oh yeah, I got a chemo treatment tonight, so I'm gonna have a bunch of pasta this afternoon, and I just love pasta. It's gonna make me feel better, and yeah, it might. And up until the point you have the chemo, and then the next time you cook that pasta, then you're like, it's gonna make sick, right? So that's something that you want to worry about. So, but that's something to avoid, at least if you know somebody getting chemo, and they haven't been told that. It might be a good thing to remind them of. Yes, that's what it says. Right? Your book covers a great example, but the idea is, how do you become regular without the use of a medication all the time, right? And maybe you've got some medical issues, or maybe you're just having troubles with it, and maybe your diet doesn't let you be regular. Well, you can use classical conditioning to produce a sort of regular response when it comes to defecating, right? And the book goes, like I said, the book goes through. It seems a little humorous, but it's true. You take a laxative and then you pair it with something else. I think the example in your book is a mild shock, right? So then eventually that mild shock will yield the conditioned response of defecating. Right? So you can get yourself on a schedule, and then you can fade out that US of the laxative. And it works. It's been effective. I know there's one example in the book, but there's many examples out there if you dig into the literature. Okay? Nocturnal enuresis. Right? So for those of you that don't know, it's bedwetting. Right? So what do bedwetting pads do? Okay? They make a noise. Right? They do all sorts of stuff. Okay? There's also, they protect the bed, blah, blah, blah. But one of the things that they do are they make a noise. Okay? The idea is you learn to detect that stimulus. So if you pee, okay, then the sound goes off. The sound is a conditioned stimulus, and you learn to detect that, okay? Or you hear that and it wakes you up, and that type of thing. Right? So that condition. So and what you learn to detect. And so I'm sorry. Let me try this example again. I got a little confused with my slide there for a second. So again, the bedwetting pad. If you urinate, it's going to make a sound. It's going to make a little buzz or something like that. You can detect that. That buzz will wake you up. So that buzz is an unconditional stimulus for getting up. Right? But what you're trying to do is pair that buzz with that feeling that you have inside of you of having to go to the bathroom. So ultimately what you want is that feeling to wake you up. So if we've got the bedwetting pad on, right, then it's going to go, but you're going to get that feeling before then. Now you're not even awake and this stuff is working. And it works like a charm, by the way. Then the idea is that you'll detect that feeling inside of you that it's time to go to the bathroom. So you get up and you go to the bathroom, and you then basically are reinforced. Right? So reinforcement is then going to sort of take over because you're avoiding the wetness, you're avoiding all that stuff. But the idea is that this is sort of a combination of classical conditioning and operant, which kind of hints at what the next chapter is about. But again, that classical conditioning here is learning to detect that feeling inside your body, that CS. And the US is the noise that actually happens. This isn't a punisher. A lot of people think these are punishers. It's not. It's about developing a new response and about you being able to tell when that response happens. And a lot of kids, believe it or not, don't know that feeling, and that's that feeling of I have to pee. They may be able to sense it a little bit, but it's not salient to them. It's not obvious. They're too excited. They're too doing their other stuff, or they're too deep asleep, and they just pee. And that's it sounds kind of odd as I'm sitting here talking about it, but that's very normal, and that's one of the difficulties that some children have with learning to go to the bathroom. And a lot of people overthink it. They're like, "Oh, my kid just doesn't want to pee in the toilet," and it's like, no. It probably, one of the first thoughts you should have if you're having trouble with potty training is, can they tell what the feeling of having to pee is like? And until you explicitly teach that, you can't be sure that there's something else going on. So that's one of those first, it's a low-hanging fruit, so to speak. It's not, okay, that was kind of bad, but the idea is it's an easy target. That's something that you should go for first if you're having trouble with kids that are learning how to pee, or even if they're, bedwetting at night. Okay, so, all right. That's about it. There's a bunch more that we could go on and on and on about this stuff. So we'll talk together when we get a chance, and enjoy your test.